Hi, everyone. We're just going to do. Oh, good. It is picking up. Hello. 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 Okay, that is picking it up. Okay, so I'm just going to do. I'm just going to get Instagram live going right now, really quick. And then we'll get started on this article. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Kind of washed out by the light, huh? Like, I wish it weren't so bright. Okay, it's a little bit less intense now. A little bit less intense. Okay, cool. And that mic is still working. Okay, let's go. Hi, everyone. In case you're watching a recording of this, just really quickly, I am reading an excerpt. Actually, I'm reading the entirety of an article by The Guardian called Our Unequal Earth, the Disposable U.S. Workforce, Life as an Essential, quote unquote, essential meatpacking plant worker. Workers are still waiting for reforms to an industry in which 60,000 got COVID and nearly 300 died. This is by Aaron Nelson in Cactus, Texas, photography by Encarni Pindado. A memorial marks the site. Oh, that's actually a caption for one of the things we're not going to talk about. Okay. Jose Tovar believes he can pinpoint the day he got COVID-19. It was April 8th, 2020, and he was cutting chuck bone at a meatpacking plant in Texas, a little town in the Texas Panhandle. Cactus might be a small place, but if you regularly eat beef in the US at one time or another, it very likely came from the JBS meatpacking plant here, where Tovar was one of its 3,000 workers. The day he caught COVID, Tovar remembers that the man working next to him on the line was visibly ill. Just 2 days later, Tovar, an immigrant from the northern Mexican border state of Coahuila, was short of breath and had a fever. Company management refused to share the health status of his coworker, Tovar recalls, and he was told it was up to him if he tested for COVID-19. He tested positive the next day and then went into quarantine. At one point in the initial weeks of the crisis, supervisors at the Cactus facility instructed workers to use hair nets rather than masks to cover their nose and mouth, according to Tovar. Quote, "It was absolutely ridiculous," said Tovar. At the time, it didn't occur to him that he would have to fight so hard to prove that he caught COVID at work, or that in the coming weeks, hundreds of his coworkers would uh, would be infected, or that meat plant workers would be hit so hard by the pandemic that representatives would liken their experience to that of a quote disposable workforce. The human costs are still being fully comprehended. Last month, a House subcommittee report found that workers at the leading U.S. meatpacking plants experienced cases and deaths that were up to 3 times previous estimates. For Tovar and many other workers, the early response by the big firms was key and indicative of long term systemic concerns about safety. The World Health Organization declared the coronavirus a pandemic in mid March last year, and Texas's governor classified its spread across the state as a disaster. Yet, for nearly a month, JBS did not do enough to protect its employees at the Cactus facility, many of them low paid refugees or immigrants, according to interviews with workers, union leaders, and experts. Quote, you just have to look at the conditions in plants to understand the way that folks were crowded without masks was an epicenter of transmission, said Melissa Perry, chair of environmental and occupational health at George Washington University. Perry was an expert for Tovar in a lawsuit he later filed for compensation benefits from the insurer after missing work for weeks due to COVID. Worker representatives recalled that when some people brought masks from home, human resources ordered them removed. Quote, JBS was that concerned people were going to get scared or excited about mask use, said Celestino Rivera, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union representative for the Cactus plant. Asked about its response to the outbreak, JBS said it, quote, aggressively prioritized health and safety through a range of steps to keep the coronavirus out of its facilities as early as February 2020. It said that to instruct workers to wear hairnets as opposed to masks would have been a violation of company policy. In mid-April, the company began to install plastic dividers between workers, hand out masks, and check temperatures at the entrance of the building. Employees 65 years and older were kept from the plant, and anyone experiencing COVID symptoms was advised to quarantine at home. Still, there was immense pressure felt by employees to keep working as staffing shortages raised the specter of a temporary shutdown. The company even resorted to cash and stake incentives to keep workers on the line. By the end of the month, the Trump administration had stepped in to declare meat processing plants as, quote, critical infrastructure. Quote, we felt there were instances where supervisors, because they were short-handed, were trying to convince individuals to continue working, Rivera said. State health investigators in late April were tracking at least 159 coronavirus infections tied to the Cactus plant, including one death associated with the outbreak, the Texas Tribune reported at the time. When Tovar returned to work in May, he said that in banners and other communications, there was a big focus on the essential workers message. They kept telling us we were essential so that we wouldn't complain, Tovar said. It felt wrong. Tovar said the processor was getting by with a depleted workforce, which made the pace of production daunting. Frustrated, some of his coworkers passed around the number of Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, a nonprofit organization that provides pro bono legal services to low-income people across Texas. Quote, I wasn't looking for money, and I didn't care if JBS fired me, unquote, Tovar said. I wanted to fight for justice. There were 914 COVID cases associated with that JBS plant by the end of June 2020, Texas Health and Human Services told The Guardian in an email. Cactus is probably best known for a Waylon Jennings song named after the town, an immigration raid that hit the meatpacker in 2006, and a tornado that ripped through the town that following year. These days, the streets of Cactus are populated by refugees and migrants. The Guardian spoke to more than 30 workers in the town. Many had stories about how tough life could be working in the plant even before the pandemic. Some described injuries, including one man who showed The Guardian his hand where one of his fingers had been amputated in an accident at the plant. Considering the blood-drenched environment of a slaughterhouse, it should come as little surprise that the industry relies heavily upon, and the government is complicit in providing, foreign-born workers to fill jobs that most American citizens won't do. Although traumatic injuries from ultra-sharp knives and bone-crushing machines are common, the gradual wear and tear of the job can also break a body. Existing protections simply do not account for the physical toll of disassembling thousands of animals into their saleable parts for a living. Ultimately, it took the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic to fully expose the vulnerability of the nation's meat processing workers. From the start of the pandemic until September, nearly 60,000 slaughterhouse workers at the major firms have contracted the coronavirus, and at least 298 of them have died. Wow. An exact accounting of the virus's toll may never be known, in part because of what has been described as weak oversight and a hands-off approach to workplace Haha, that's neighbors. An exact accounting of the virus's toll may never be known, in part because of what has been described as a weak oversight and hands-off approach to workplace inspections that were features of the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, enforcement under the Trump administration. I'm going to read that one a second time because that's kind of a big deal. An exact accounting of the virus's toll may never be known, in part because of what has been described as weak oversight and a hands-off approach to workplace inspections that were features of the U.S. OSHA enforcement under Trump administration. On the campaign trail, Joe Biden cast himself as a champion of the working man, calling attention to the plight of workers in the meatpacking and processing industry. As president, Biden directed OSHA to issue new emergency temporary standards to protect workers from the spread of the coronavirus. He also paused a controversial Trump-era proposal that would have allowed some meat processors to increase line speeds beyond regulatory limits. Both steps were widely praised by worker advocates, among them Debbie Berkowitz, a former OSHA chief of staff, now a fellow at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University. But after several months in office, the momentum toward deeper reforms has stalled, Berkowitz said. The meat industry has not been held accountable for their failure to adequately protect workers, Berkowitz said. A true travesty. In a statement, OSHA said it was committed to worker safety and added that, as Biden had ordered, it was continuing to review its response to COVID. Worker advocates and safety experts say the administration has barely scratched the surface of the problems baked into the industry's DNA. The pandemic opened a window into the working conditions inside these plants, said Celeste Monfronten, workplace safety expert. But the attention has not really extended to the underlying causes. Large multinational companies dominate the $227 billion market, and before the pandemic, about 8 workers died annually, while the coronavirus has claimed at least 30 times that number. Industry critics say foreign workers are particularly susceptible to exploitation, and the U.S. refugee settlement system funnels refugees to slaughterhouse jobs. Nearly 40% of the U.S. meat industry workforce is foreign born, and in Texas, the number is closer to 56%. Our government has partnered with the meat industry to bring refugees so that they have a workforce that is vulnerable and scared, Berkowitz said. And they get away with it because the industry is hidden from public view. Advocates say that the Biden administration has shown no indication that it will take on the social conditions and policy environments that endanger lives of workers, such as requiring that the industry engage in health and safety research. It is all true. It's from The Guardian. Attention has turned for now to the congressional panel investigation into how the world's largest meatpacking companies have handled the pandemic. The investigation, opened in February by the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis, said not only had JBS USA, Smithfield Foods, and Tyson Foods refused to take basic precautions to protect their workers, they had, quote, shown a callous disregard for workers' health. In September, the committee's chair, Jim Clyburn, added Cargill and National Beef Packing Company, National Beef, to its investigation. Yes, those are true. With barely 21,000 residents spread over 900 square miles of windswept plains, the people of Moore County, where Cactus is located, have cultivated a sort of frontier mentality. Perhaps that partly explains why county officials speak so supportively about its largest employer, JBS. Tommy Brooks, the county's emergency coordinator, bristled at the suggestion that the company or county officials should have acted sooner to protect workers. Quote, "This is a very reputable company," Brooks said. JBS did what they needed to do to make sure their people stayed as safe as they possibly could while still providing food to the American people. The company claims to have adopted measures beyond federal guidance and industry standards, including ordering face masks in March and requiring their use in April. Moreover, the company said workers who tested positive for COVID received up to 26 weeks of pay at the short-term disability pay rate of between 60 to 70% of their base pay. And COVID-related healthcare costs were covered in full, while the families of workers who died from the coronavirus received compensation equal to at least 1 year's salary, according to JBS. We strongly disagree with any claim that suggests we have not prioritized the safety of our workforce at all times throughout this pandemic, JBS said in a statement. When the Department of State Health Services initially offered assistance, the company refused, and as far as Brooks and the county judge, Rowdy Rhodes, could see, there was no reason to doubt the company's decision. With at least 3,476 sick and 85 dead, Rhodes acknowledged the devastation caused by the coronavirus in his county. He added that COVID restrictions that shuttered businesses was tragic in its own right. Quote, "This sounds stupid for me to say, but we're in God's country," unquote, Rhodes said of how the county endured the pandemic. Quote, "God takes care of us," unquote. Tovar missed 3 weeks of work with COVID and had a fight to get fully compensated from a state workers' compensation insurance scheme. Since the passage of the Texas Workers' Compensation Act in 1989, it has become exceedingly difficult for workers to sue over injuries or illnesses that occurred at work. Texas businesses are not required to subscribe to the workers' compensation program, but the ones that do cannot be sued for negligence. Quote, the system is anti-worker, anti-safety, and designed to benefit big business, said John Gibson, a Lubbock-based workers' compensation lawyer. With few legal options, Tovar filed suit in May of 2020 against American Zurich Insurance Company, a participant in a workers' compensation insurance program, which had denied him temporary income benefits for missed work. His claim was rejected by the insurance company, so Chris Benoit, Tovar's attorney, took his case to the Texas Department of Insurance's Division of Workers' Compensation. Holy shit, what? So Tovar's attorney took his case to the Texas Department of Insurance's Division of Workers' Compensation. Okay. Benoit had to prove that Tovar contracted the virus at work, something that very few workers' compensation cases involved respiratory diseases have found. His expert witness was Melissa Perry, the epidemiologist from George Washington University. In the 2 weeks before his infection, Perry told The Guardian that JBS did virtually nothing to limit the spread of the virus. She based her opinion in part on crowded working conditions and photos that Tovar took of the plant's locker room. Quote, everyone was just huddled together, no masks, Perry said. Benoit argued that JBS did not socially distance its employees or require masks at the time Tovar was exposed to the virus. The only reasonable epidemiological conclusion, she said, was that the virus was transmitted to Tovar inside the plant. What was also clear from her assessment is that one thing that they had to do is that, what was also clear from her assessment is that the one thing they had to do to lower the risk of exposure in an outbreak like this was to reduce the line speed and space out workers, Benoit said of Perry's testimony, and that's just not something they were willing to do. The insurer dragged out his case for a year, but in May it lost and paid Tovar that $1,300 in lost benefits in what was seen as a quote rare win for workers. Critics say that the business model of meat processors is designed to sustain the health of the industry and not its employees. Injured and sick workers are looked after by a pool of company-approved doctors who, critics say, send them back to work so that production won't suffer and the company can avoid reporting lost workdays to OSHA. Employers were slow to protect their workers, Tovar's expert Perry said, adding that OSHA failed to enforce infection control requirements. Quote, what can change if there's really no data? If there's really no information, if the companies say things are fine and OSHA, which may never set foot inside the plant, accepts that on face value, said Perry. For a change, union officials say the administration is listening to their concerns and seeking their input. By January this year, just 5 meatpacking plants have been fined a total of $69,000 for COVID-19 violations. Rather than strengthen worker protections, Texas lawmakers made it even harder to challenge negligent employers when it passed Senate Bill 6 this June. The law shields businesses from lawsuits that ostensibly acted in good faith during the pandemic. The law shields businesses from lawsuits that ostensibly acted in good faith during the pandemic. Plaintiffs must gather evidence, which in some cases, such as COVID exposure, is practically impossible, Benoit said. Despite the obstacles, Benoit believes there is still reason for hope. Mr. Tovar's case proves that insurance companies can be beat, Benoit said. Tavar stayed on at the JBS plant for months, right up until he was demoted from his chuckbone duties. The change came with a pay cut from $24 to $19 an hour. They told me I could either take the job or quit, Tovar said. At the end of October, he quit. Within days, he was working the chuck bone line at another meatpacking plant near Amarillo. Tovar fidgeted uncomfortably on the edge of his living room couch on a late May evening. He had gone under the knife to repair a hernia only a few days prior. The injury occurred while doing the same cutting, lifting, and twisting he had been doing for 3 decades in meatpacking houses. The hernia tore open, he said, and the slab of beef and knife fell from his hands at the moment. The pain was intense, he said. Workers' compensation insurance covered the cost of his hernia surgery. Just 2 days later, he was back at work for the same 6 a.m. shift. The meat processing industry has been desperate for workers, still reeling from the pandemic-related shortages and Trump-era limits on refugee arrivals, down from 110,000 to just 15,000. Some have been offering signing bonuses of up to $5,000. Amazon, meanwhile, has been building a warehouse in Amarillo, and many in the refugee communities hoped to land a job there, apparently unfazed by the stories of the tech giant's poor treatment of its workers. Tovar, for his part, has been trying to find meaning in his lawsuit. Quote, "I think I did the right thing," Tovar said. Quote, "Hopefully it helps others," unquote. So yeah, that was an article by The Guardian. I'm going to add the link. The link is in the description on YouTube, and you can totally just Google Guardian, like the keywords that I added to the title on Instagram. If you can't find it there, and it's a huge bummer. I'm just gonna review a couple of the statistics that they pointed to in this article. One is that, all right, let's get the top of this freaking thing. 60,000 workers in the meatpacking industry got COVID, and just under 300 of them died. Commercial meatpacking is a $227 billion industry. $227 billion annually. And let's see, the big 5 companies in the United States, that is Tyson, Smithfield, JBS, Cargill, and National Beef, I think. They collectively have paid out $69,000 to for in COVID protocol related fines. So that is to say, a very small amount, like a tragically small amount of money. I think this is like really horrendous, and yeah, really, really awful news for the meat industry. So I hope you all take the time to kind of sit with and digest this, the discomfort of this knowledge, of this injustice, and the way that our meat packing workers are treated. I hope you all pay attention the next time any sort of legislation goes through that has to do with lawsuits and company protections. And yeah, if you have any questions, please pop them into the comments underneath this video or DM me. But yeah, the link is available. The link to this article is available in the YouTube description. And for those of you on Instagram, you can totally Google the keywords in the title of this live stream to find it. Anyway, thanks so much for joining, and I appreciate you all. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Bye. And now.